Welcome students of Standard 9 to the History and Civics session. In the previous session, I had explained to you about our Constitution, its meaning and importance, its enactment and adoption, implementation and enforcement. I had also dealt with fundamental rights, fundamental duties, writs and some other fundamental rights included, that is right to information, right to education and right to privacy. Now in this session I will explain to you about directive principles of state policy. Directive principles of state policy has been mentioned in part 4 of the Indian Constitution. As you all know, in part 3 of the Indian Constitution, the fundamental rights have been mentioned. Part 4 has dealt with directive principles of state policy. Now, if we look into the preamble, we see that it mentions about achieving 3 goals, that is social, economic and political justice. Now, this directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights both have the responsibility of achieving these 3 goals to make India a welfare state. That is to achieve economic, political and social justice and thereafter make India a welfare state. Now, what are these directive principles of state policy? Directive principles of state policy are directions or guidelines given to the policy maker or the government or state while making the policies for the governance of our country India. Now, from where did this the Constitution get this directive principles of state policy? Means what is the source of the directive principles of state policy? It has been adopted from the Irish Constitution, from Gandhian philosophy, from the Charter of Human Rights of UNO, from the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizens of France and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Means there are 5 sources. Now, once this directive principles of state policy was adopted, what was the aim and objective of this directive principles of state policy? The aim and objective of this directive principle of state policy is to make India a welfare state and to provide social and economic justice and to create a socio-economic condition for a good life. Now you all have understood till here the sources of directive principles of state policy, the aims and objectives and goals of the directive principle of state policy. The aim, objective and goal is to fulfill the goal of the preamble, that is to achieve social, economic and political justice. Now, directive principles of state policy, as you all know, has the main motive of achieving a welfare state, and the same responsibility is of the fundamental rights. Now, what is the difference between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy? The difference between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policies are as follows. Number 1 difference is, first of all, fundamental rights are mentioned in part 3 of the Indian Constitution, whereas directive principles are mentioned in part 4 of the Indian Constitution. Secondly, fundamental rights are mentioned in Article 12 to 35, whereas directive principles are mentioned in Article 36 to 51. The fundamental rights are negative in character, means to say that it asks the state or the government what not to do, that is not to bring about inequality and arbitrariness. Whereas fundamental directive principles, they are positive in nature, means to say they tell the state or the government what to do. That is, they tell the state and government to follow the directions given under the directive principles of state policy while framing the policies of the state. Then fundamental rights are more concerned with political justice, whereas directive principles are more concerned about economic and social justice. Then fundamental rights are justiciable and enforceable, whereas directive principles are non-justiciable and non-enforceable. Means to say, if a person is denied of his fundamental rights or his fundamental rights are violated, he can move to the court to enforce to get his fundamental rights enforced. But if a government does not follow the directive principles, he or the government he cannot be, or the government cannot be brought to the court, but the government will lose public opinion. Now here I want to make it very clear that if the government does not make laws according in the interest of the people to make India a welfare state, it will lose public opinion, and in the forthcoming election it will not gain power. This is the importance of directive principles. Directive principles are, though it is not enforceable and justiciable, it is very important for the policy makers to follow it. And the force behind directive principles are the public. We, the people of India, are the force behind directive principles. If we are not satisfied with the policy makers that what law they are making is not in the serving the interest of the people, in the next coming election people will not vote for the government or for that particular government, and as a result the government will lose power. Then the knowledge of the directive principles of state policy helps the citizens to check the government and provide a framework of political, social and economic principles to achieve economic and social justice. Now all the articles under directive principles of state policy, that is from 36 to 51, they all have been divided into three categories. Means directive principles of state policy are divided into three categories. They are of three types. All the principles are of three types. The first one is socialistic principle, the second one is the Gandhian principle, and the third one is the liberal principle. The socialistic principle, they aim at establishing a welfare state and work for the social welfare of the people of India. And the government has taken various steps to ensure this Gandhian principle, to ensure this socialistic principle and to make India a welfare state. For example, adequate means of livelihood has been given to the people, social equality and justice has been promoted, right to education facility act has been implemented, then scholarship to socially and economic backward people have been given, then 5-year plan has been set up to focus on the welfare and progress of the weaker section of the society, and prohibition of untouchability has been proclaimed. Then economic welfare programs have been enacted. These are some of the socialist principle that has been adopted by the government to make India a welfare state or to implement the directive principles. Then the Gandhian principles is another directive principle which has been formulated, and they were the principle that was visioned by Gandhiji, and the government has taken various steps to reconstruct the vision of Gandhiji. The steps taken by the government are: cottage industry has been set up, then Manrega Act has been implemented to provide 100 days employment in the rural areas, Panchayati Raj system has been set up, and minimum wage has been fixed for the poor people, and equal pay for an equal wage, and equal wage has been fixed for everybody in the rural area, irrespective of caste, race, religion, etc. Then the liberal principles, which is another category of directive principles of state policy. It enforces liberalism, that is to establish uniform civil code, free and compulsory education to all from 6 to 14 years of age, separation of judiciary from executive, protection of monuments and objects of national importance, then free legal aid to those who need, those who cannot hire public lawyer, then promote international peace and security, respect international law, and protection of the environment. These are some of the measures which the government has undertaken to bring about liberalism. So now, children, I think it is very clear to you about what is the meaning of directive principle, that these are directions or guidelines which the policy makers have to keep into consideration while making laws. And what is the source of directive principles? That is, it has been adopted from the Irish Constitution. Then what is the aim and objective? To achieve the goal of the preamble, that is of economic, social and political justice. Then what are the various principles of directive principles of or categories of directive principles of state policy? That is the Gandhian principle, the socialist principle, socialistic principle, and the liberal principle. Then about the difference between directive principles and fundamental rights, all these things I have already discussed, that directive principles are mentioned in part 4 of the Indian Constitution, whereas fundamental rights are mentioned in part 3 of the Indian Constitution. Directive principles are not enforceable and non-justiciable, whereas fundamental rights are enforceable and justiciable. Directive principles and fundamental rights both have the responsibility of achieving economic, social and political justice. Thank you.